Hello everyone, this is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and welcome to this tutorial that is all about the bullion stitch. Now the bullion stitch is one of those stitches that so many people say, I don't like that stitch, or I can't do that stitch, or I've tried it and I really dislike that stitch. And that's understandable because of all the embroidery stitches out there, it's not one of the ones that the first time you try it, you're going to be a success. I wasn't either. But it really is an interesting stitch. It's a fun stitch once you get the hang of it, and it can give you some really neat effects. For instance, let me show you this one. This is I used bullion stitches to create this rose in the middle. And so they just, they wrap around in a spiral. And this is an example of why a variegated thread works so beautifully with bullion stitches, because it really does give you some neat effects with the variegation in the colors. You can also, I used it on this one right here, this flower right here, this viola. So if you just want, I kind of wanted those French knots to sort of be buried inside those, look like they were buried in the center underneath there. So it just gives it a little bit of 3 dimension. And so you can tell that you don't have to have a whole lot of them for it to be an interesting effect and to be very useful. I also used them right here on these stitches. And so that's also a variegated thread. So, I could have just made those straight stitches, but it was much more interesting to make them bullion stitches and give them that texture and that dimension. So I don't want to make you wait any longer. So let's jump right into the basic how to make a bullion stitch. But keep watching after we do this, because I'm going to talk a lot more in depth about how to make, if you're not successful at first, why, how different threads and all the different things can affect why you're not happy immediately with your bullion stitch. But let's get right to the basic how to. So here's my stitch length. I come up at the top. Oh, I forgot to say one thing. One of the most important things about bullion stitches is the needle that you use. This is called a Milliners needle. See if you can see the eye. It's a little bit hard right there. This is called a Milliners needle, and that is because it is one width all the way from the eye down here to the point. In other words, the shaft, the eye is not bigger. The area around where the eye is doesn't stick out any. It's one width all the way down. And so that makes a huge difference when you are pulling your needle through all of this thread that we're about to do. When I first started doing bullion stitches, I had heard you needed a Milliners needle, and I thought, oh, you know what, that's fine, I can just do it without it. You can make bullion stitches without a Milliners needle, but trust me, it makes it so much easier and you'll be much more successful. So it is worth it. All right, basic how to. Come up at the top. Oh, one other thing I forgot to tell you. I am using, for this demonstration, right here at the beginning, I will do something different a little bit later, but I am using DMC pearl thread, the number 5 size. So this is a thread that is not like the stranded DMC, so you don't separate this, so it just stays just like it is, just like the way it comes out of the skein like this. So that's what I'm using for this demonstration. All right, back to the how-to. Come up at the top, go down at the bottom of your stitch, but keep a loop of thread. Don't pull the thread all the way through. Keep some working thread right here. And now you're going to come up at the top of the stitch, right where that thread comes out of the fabric. But again, you're not going to pull the needle all the way through. Leave the needle just like that. Now comes the part where we're going to wrap the needle. So I'm going to take this working thread and I'm going to wrap it around the needle. So that's what's going to give us the sort of tube effect of the stitch. So now I'm going to wrap the pearl thread 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. I'm going to push those wraps towards the fabric, and the way I have the needle now, it's very convenient that I can, from the back, I can manipulate it like this. I can also fold it over. Once those threads are down by the fabric, I can fold it over and see if that stitch is going to be the right length, if I have enough wraps to make this stitch length correct. So to go from here to here. Because I want this to be a flat stitch. We'll do curved stitches a little bit later. But that, I've already done this stitch length, so I know that that's the correct number of wraps. So now that I have that, I'll come back up and I will hold those wraps with this hand, those two fingers, and I will pull the needle and the thread through those wraps. So I'm still holding on to those wraps. Here's the part where it gets a little bit, you're never quite sure if it's going to turn out. Let me pull that aside so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to pull that thread through. When I get to about there, I'm going to pull this thread and lay it down flat on the fabric, and I'm going to pull it towards me. I'm also going to take the tip of the needle and push those wraps, kind of keep them up at the top there. I'm going to keep pulling that thread gently, and I'm not yanking on it, but just gently until everything kind of lays flat against the fabric. Now I can take my needle and go down at the end of the stitch. And there is my first bullion stitch. So now let me do that again. Bring your needle out at the top of the stitch. Go down at the bottom of the stitch. Keep some working thread. Come back out at the same place where the the thread is coming out at the top of the stitch, and then now wrap the thread around the needle. Push the wraps down towards the fabric. You can fold the needle over to see if your stitch length is correct. Hold those wraps with your fingers. Pull that thread through. When you get to about here, pull this thread towards you. Use the tip of the needle to keep the wraps towards the top, and then take the needle down at the bottom of the stitch. And one more time. Come out at the top of the stitch. Go down at the bottom of the stitch. Pull the needle through, but keep some working thread out. Bring the needle up at the top of the stitch. Wrap this thread around the needle. Push those wraps towards the fabric. Fold the needle over if you need to. Hold the wraps on the needle. Pull the thread through. Pull the thread towards you and use the needle to push those wraps towards the top, and then put the needle down at the bottom of the stitch. Now let's look at some different things that will affect how these bullion stitches look. One of the things that can have the biggest impact on what your stitch looks like is the direction in which you wrap the thread around the needle. And that is because every thread has a direction of its twist. Some threads are S twist and some are Z twist. And to be perfectly honest, I can never remember which thread is which direction. If I need that information, I have to go look it up somewhere. So we're, again, using the purl thread. And like I said, I think maybe this is an S twist, perhaps. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But so far, we have done these 3 stitches by wrapping the thread counterclockwise around the needle. Let's do some stitches where we wrap it the other direction. So here we are. Everything's the same so far. But now, instead of wrapping it this way, as we did before, we are going to wrap it this direction, because clocks, go around this way. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Push those wraps down. I can fold it over. Looks like that's still a good number of wraps. Pull the thread through and push those wraps up. Let me do it one more time, wrapping clockwise. So go clockwise. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, that one went really kind of not great. So looking at these three were counterclockwise. These two were clockwise. And it's a little bit hard to see a huge difference when you're using the pearl thread. But I know, I can tell that these three just retain the quality of their wraps a little bit better. They're more defined. These look a little bit messier because what happens is the thread becomes a little bit unwrapped, which when you're using a pearl thread like this, it doesn't come unwrapped quite like it does on a DMC stranded thread, which I'll show you a little bit later. But I can just tell that these just keep their form better. These just look messier. So I know from doing this that if I really wanted to, I mean, you might want that look, but I just prefer the way these look. So when I use pearl thread, I like to wrap my thread counterclockwise around the needle. One really neat thing about bullion stitches is that you can change the look of it depending on how many wraps you make. So we've already done these, which we know are flat. We know that it takes 6 wraps to go from here to here to make a flat stitch. But if I wanted to make a stitch that is curved, like would curve up above the fabric, all I need to do is add more wraps. So up at the top, down at the bottom, come up at where the thread comes out. And now I'm going to wrap, but I'm not going to wrap 6 times. I'm going to wrap, let's do 9 or 10. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6, 7, 8. Let's do 9, and let's just do 10. So it'll be really curved. So if I fold it over, you can see that that is too many wraps to make that a flat stitch. But what is going to happen if I pull it through, and as you get more wraps, that's where that milliner's needle becomes really even more important, because if you put, you can do a bullion stitch that has 20 wraps on it, and if you're trying to pull a needle that has a big eye through that, it's much harder. So anyway, so now I've pulled my thread through. So now when I pull on this, it's not going to lay flat. It will take the needle down. Now it will curve. So I can, if I wanted to make a rose, I could push it over to the side. If you wanted it to, be raised this way, that could be interesting. You could go over to that side. So the more wraps, the more curved it's going to be. You can, if let's say your stitch was like from here to here, like this little bitty tiny, you could come up here, go down here, come back up, and you could put 15 wraps, and it can make a complete, like a loop, more like a daisy stitch. Sort of looks like a daisy stitch, but made out of wraps. So that is how to make a curved stitch, or a raised curved stitch, versus a flat stitch. Since we are talking about what it looks like in different types of thread, let's try some DMC stranded thread. This is just the regular 6-stranded thread. It's all 6 strands. I have not stripped it or separated it or in any way. I'm using it just exactly the way it comes off of the skein. I am still using the same exact needle as before, the Milliners needle. So let's start out doing, let's go clockwise with this thread. I have a knot on the back there. It's kind of hard to get that needle up in the same spot. Hang on, just take a second to, all right. So, all right, now I'm at the top. I've come out at the top. So let's go clockwise, I think I said. So let's try, we knew with the pearl thread it was 6 wraps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's see if it's the same. And it appears that if I go clockwise, it is the same. That's a good fit for that stitch to fill that stitch in so it's flat. I'm going to pull that through. And I was pretty lucky. That one turned out pretty good. I do find that the DMC is a little bit more, it's a little trickier to work with because the strands can separate a little bit on you as you're pulling. You know, sometimes I get like one little strand that doesn't want to, you know, behave with the rest. They doesn't kind of want to stick together or something. So I do find it a little bit harder to use than the pearl. The pearl thread just seems to sort of stick together better and play nicely. But so anyway, that was the clockwise. Let me do one more clockwise. And I like the look of that. So I'm going to go clockwise again. Also a hint when you're doing, not so much if you're just doing one or two stitches, but when I'm doing repeated stitches all in a row, this is one of those stitches where it really pays to let your needle hang and let the thread untwist, because all this twisting and wrapping you're doing, the thread can get sort of twisted up and it'll start to do that a lot, and it's can kind of knot up on itself. So that's something to keep in mind. But all right, clockwise. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Check my needle length. So, you know, maybe I made those dots a little bit further apart. So can you see that, how that I could maybe get one more wrap in there to make that. So I'm just going to make this one 7. Check it again. That seems good. It's really just more a function of the dots being a little bit further apart on that one. So that looks pretty good. Now let's try counterclockwise. Just as before, I'll come up at the top, down at the bottom, leave some working thread, come back up at the top, leave my needle partway through. Now I'm going to go counterclockwise. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And right away you can see a difference. If I fold that needle over, you can see how long suddenly all those wraps make that stitch look. It's like too long for this stitch length. 6 wraps before, notwithstanding that last one. All of these others, it's taken 6 wraps. Now it's way too long. And the reason for that is because as I was wrapping counterclockwise, that thread was getting flattened out. So do you see right there how it looks more like a flat ribbon now as opposed to a ropey twist? That's what happens when I wrap DMC stranded thread counterclockwise. So that's too many wraps. So let me back up. Well, let me just do it again because I can't remember. 1, 2, 3. Let's see if 4 wraps is enough. 4 wraps is probably going to be okay. So let me try 4. Pull that through. And here's one of the reasons why I find DMC a little tricky to use. See how that one down there just did not get quite as tight. It's kind of a little weird down there. But anyway, okay, so this one, on the DMC over here where we wrapped clockwise, you can see more defined wraps. On this one, it kind of flattens out. It looks like you've wrapped a bunch of thread a whole lot, but we actually did fewer wraps here. Let me do it one more time. Gonna wrap counterclockwise. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that the same? Yeah, 4 wraps works. Still got a little bit of that strangeness at the bottom. But so take a look at these. These two, the DMC was one direction, these two were the other direction. So this is not necessarily wrong. It just depends on what look you want. If you want the more defined uh, differentiation between the wraps, choose this direction. If you want it to look more smooth and like it's finer thread because it gets flattened out as you go counterclockwise, choose this one. It really is a function of just practicing it first and deciding what you want and knowing whether you're using pearl thread or DMC or yarn or silk thread or whatever kind of yarn or thread you are using. Do a test first and decide which direction you want to make the wrap so that you know how your stitch is going to look when you make it on your piece. I am going to talk for just a moment about practice. And the bullion stitch is definitely one of those stitches that you will need to and want to practice. Some stitches, you know, you can just look at a video tutorial, watch them do 1 or 2 stitches, and you can do it yourself. Or you can look at a diagram, and it's easy to figure out how to do it, and it comes out great the second time you do it. The bullion stitch is not one of those stitches. It is definitely a stitch that needs practice. And I'm going to show you my chaotic practice hoop. I always keep a hoop of fabric nearby so that it's an 8-inch hoop, I just put white fabric in it. It has lots of space so I can just randomly do all kinds of stitches. I can test out threads and styles and stitches and all sorts of things. But I think you can see on here all of the bullion. More than anything else, I've practiced the bullion stitch. And I've tried different threads and I've tried, I'm figuring out the length of the stitch and how many wraps it takes and which kind of thread works best and which direction to go, clockwise, counterclockwise, all those kinds of things. You can see like here's like all of these, just one right after another. Practice, practice, practice. These up here, figuring out length. These up here, figuring out direction. I made notes to myself. Counterclockwise, five wraps, and counterclockwise. This one up here, I was practicing the viola that I showed you earlier, like how many wraps to make it just slightly curve. So the point being that it is worth practicing. Every time I do, particularly bullion stitch, I always practice a bunch of times. And before I started this video, I did, 25 of these before I started this video, just so I could warm up that hand, brain, eye connection so that it settles in and I know what I'm doing. And you'll just be happier when you do this stitch, practice it, and I promise it's just, don't get discouraged if you make 3 stitches and they all look bad. Don't get discouraged. Keep practicing, because I've done 10 stitches in a row when every single one looked bad. Like, look at these. None of these look like that one was good, and then it went back to looking bad. And same down here. See these, bad, too thin, not enough wraps. That one was good, and then I went back to not so great too, and then that one was good, and then those kind of iffy. Whatever. Don't get discouraged if it's not, beautiful the second stitch you do. Keep working at it. I promise you'll get it, and it will look good, and it'll be worth it. Now let's talk about some things that can go wrong and why. And one of the most common issues you might have is not putting enough wraps, and it'll just, you'll have like some thread showing underneath, and that's obvious. That, like I mentioned, practicing. If you do a bunch of stitches of the exact length you're going to want, you can figure out how many wraps you're going to need. But let's talk about some other things that could go wrong. So here I am. I know it takes 6 wraps to make a flat stitch, and I know that the counterclockwise looks best, but now I'm going to I'm not going to be real careful about how tight my wraps are, how even, not about tightness so much, but how even they are. So that's 1, 2, 3, let me go back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hang on. All right, here we go again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so I have not been careful about how each wrap is the same tension. I am also not going to be careful about the fact that I'm going to let those wraps kind of twist on top of each other. Can you see that right there? like it's pulling back that way. See how that one is laying on top as opposed to being lined up. All right, so I'm going to let the wraps be too loose. I'm going to twist over it. I'm not going to push them together neatly, but I'm going to hold it. We're going to just see. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. So I pulled through, and now I have a mess. So see, even if I try, well, you know what? It kind of came together, but it's not very even. All right, that was pure luck. It could have been a disaster. But it is loose, and it's not even. I can keep pulling on it, and it's just, you're like playing with fire right there. It's really better when you're wrapping that needle to make sure that the tension is the same for each wrap and that they are lined up, they're stacked up so they're not twisted on top of each other. Let's do something else. That one ended up, who knows? Maybe you want it to look kind of organic like that, but let's do one that is really, really tight. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I am really, really choking up on those wraps. They are crazy tight. I'm going to push them down, but they are tight. One thing about tight stitches is that you can maybe see that even though I wrapped at 6, it's not quite, maybe not going to fill that, but it is super tight. And even with this Milliners needle, I'm going to have trouble pulling it through, but I did it. So now when I pull, see how, again, not horrible, but it's pretty thin. If I had done that with a DMC stranded thread, it would just kind of not look good at all. It wouldn't have any plumpness to it. Let's see what it looks like with not enough wraps. All right, so I know 6 is the right number. 1, 2, 3. Let's do 3. All right, doesn't cover. It just looks like, obviously it's just not going to cover it. There's something else that can happen. It's kind of a delicate balance, sort of a dance between how much you tug on that thread. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Push the wraps down. Okay, it's kind of a delicate balance between right here. This is kind of a critical spot right here. If you, like I mentioned, I like to pull it towards me and pull this thread this way towards me. If I just pull without using the tip of my needle to push those up, it doesn't form up. It's too loose up here and it's strange down there, okay? So that's why you do want to push those wraps up. But if I pull too hard, I also, those just, they don't even exist anymore. The wraps are just so choked up on that thread, it doesn't really look like much. And it's too tight up there and it's strange down here. So don't, pull on it a little bit when you get to the bottom so that everything kind of forms up, but don't pull so hard that you just obliterate the entire stitch. I want to talk briefly about the stab method versus the sewing method for bullion stitches. And the stab method is what I use for 99.9% of all of my stitching. But if you look at a lot of the tutorials for bullion stitch, many of them will show you the sewing method. And let me show you what I'm talking about. So you start out just the same, but here's where it gets different. If you are doing the sewing method, you put your needle down into the fabric and you come up like that. And that's the sewing method. I don't really care for this method because I keep my fabric so tight in the hoop that it's a little bit tricky for me to do that. If you're going to do that with bullion stitches, it's fine. It works great. If that's more comfortable for you and works better for you, and if your stitches turn out better for you this way, definitely do it this way. So if you wanted to do the sewing method, you're going to put your needle through like that. Move it down a little bit. I know those other stitches are in the way. And then you can you can push it up. See, I'm not very good at this method because I never do it. And you can sort of angle that needle up like that, and then you can wrap your thread like that. You can even put a finger under it to hold those wraps like that. All right, you see that? And then it's the same thing. You would hold these wraps and pull the needle through. So you end up in the same exact place. You just make one motion for the needle instead of all the way down and then halfway up from the back. If that doesn't make much sense, I know. But like I said, because my fabric is so tight, I am more fluid. I feel like it's easier for me to do the stab method. So you come all the way up, go all the way down, but keep the thread, and then you push the needle up halfway. This also gives you the ability to spin the needle this way. But like I said, this way absolutely works. If it works for you, that's great. You can do either way. I want to talk very briefly about how to know where your stitch is going to end up on the fabric. And I know that sounds strange, but this is something that really confused me at first because didn't draw any dots. Okay, because it's obvious when you're making them all in a straight line like this, you know that they're going to be all in the same place, all lined up like that. But if you're, what confused me was the fact that because I am, what I have to tell myself that the stitch is going to sit on the fabric between these two dots. I come up at the top, down at the bottom. But what was confusing to me was the fact that because you're up here and then you're doing all this work up here, I'm up on you, especially if you move the needle like that, you're up here. And at first I was like, well, does that mean the stitch is going to sit on the fabric up there? That's why I was confused. So I have to constantly remind myself that, and it does help if you can bend the needle back that way and lay the stitch down and say, okay, well, that's where the stitch is going to be. And the reason, like I said, it's obvious when you're just doing stitches like this that are just, in random space. But for instance, on this rose, it's much more confusing because you've got them all going in a spiral at different angles. So for instance, on a rose like that, you would perhaps, let me go over here, you would have something that looked like this. And that might be where your stitches are. That gets more confusing because you are going to, let's say you're going to do this stitch right here, or let's do one right on the inside, right here. Let's call this the top, this the bottom. So you come up at the top, down at the bottom, come back out. And so, obviously, 3, 4, let me see that. It's probably going to take about 4. Let's just do that. Did that one fast. I don't know if it's going to turn out nice or not. And then the next one is going to be from here to here. And so you do have to sort of keep track of where your stitches are going to, as I said, sit on the fabric. Let me go ahead and do the next stitch that you would probably do when making this rose. So it's going to be this one from here to here. The end of that stitch is right there. It's a little bit hard to see because it's sort of tucked under that first stitch. But there's the top of my stitch. There's the bottom of the stitch. And as I showed you earlier, I'm going to want this one to be curved because I don't want it to sit. I don't want it to necessarily be straight. I want it to be curved. So I'll add more wraps to make it curved. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Maybe go one more. 7. Well, let's just do 8. But here's where you can see that it might get confusing about where your stitch is going to sit on your pattern. You've got all these lines going different directions. They're not all parallel. You're working up here above the stitch, but the stitch is actually going to be down here. So what it helps to remind myself is that the top of this, the stitch is going to sit on the fabric between here and here, even though I'm wrapping it up here. So I wrapped it now. Lost my needle. I can keep pulling it though. All right. Still can pull it. Tighten it up a little bit. It's going to curve that way. I had to go put my thread back on my needle, but now I can take that thread down to the back. And now that one curves around there and it sits right there. And I would do the same thing if I was going to do a stitch that went from here to here. This would be the top. That would be the bottom of the stitch. And then I'd come out here. And then I would wrap my needle and go on my way. So that is just a little mini tutorial on how to do a bullion stitch rose, but I think that covers just about everything you need to know to do some successful bullion stitches, and I definitely want to encourage you, please don't give up on bullion stitches. If you've tried them before and you've tried it a couple times and just said this is a complete failure or these are all a disaster, don't worry, we've all had disastrous bullion stitches, myself included. So keep practicing. They really are a neat addition to your repertoire of embroidery stitches, and so hopefully you can learn to, if not maybe like them, maybe even love them. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll join me next time.